So, what's up with the revolutions lately? Are they happening more frequently, or is this just how it's always been? Is a revolution just an organic response to oppression, or is there something more to it? Let's go ahead and take a quick look at some of the major players involved in several political revolutions throughout history. We'll look specifically at the Bolshevik Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Ugandan coup, and the Cuban Revolution, and see if it sheds some light on the question, what is a revolution? So let's look first at the financing behind the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917. In the early 1900s, Jewish banker Jacob Schiff was believed to be the richest man in America. He often spoke publicly about the role he and other Jews had played in the Bolshevik Revolution. Here are some articles from the New York Times that capture some of those public statements. In Untermeyer joins protest en route, Schiff states, "And thanks are due to the Jew that the Russian Revolution succeeded." And then, in Pacifists Pester till Mayor calls them traitor, Rabbi Stephen Wise boasts about a propaganda campaign in Russia that was financed by Schiff. Lenin, who rose to power in the aftermath, was partly Jewish himself, and his second-in-command, Trotsky, was also Jewish. In fact, much of the new Bolshevik leadership was Jewish, especially at the top levels. So, with that said, I tend to agree with Schiff. Without Jewish financing and leadership, it's unlikely the revolution would have been successful. But this should be familiar information for anyone who studied the Bolshevik Revolution. So let's shift east now to a revolution we probably know less about. Okay, so next we'll have a look at Mao Zedong, who rose to power in China in 1949. With him, on the far left in this photo, we have Israel Epstein. And then, beginning from the far right, we have Solomon Adler and Frank Coe, and then the woman next to Mao is Anna Louise Strong. All four are Jewish. 2 points of interest here. First, Frank Coe served in the U.S. Treasury Department and later went on to work for the International Monetary Fund. Before moving to China, Coe was called to testify before a House Committee on Un-American Activities regarding his involvement with the Communist Party USA. He pleaded the fifth and no further action was taken. Secondly, Polish-born Israel Epstein, a journalist and propagandist, became one of the few non-Chinese members in the Chinese Communist Party. His role in the party is murky, although he may have served in the Ministry of Appropriations, which would have been a powerful position. And then finally in this photo, we see Sidney Shapiro, a member of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Council. While the presence of Jews in the Bolshevik Revolution isn't surprising, given the large amount of Jews living in Russia, the presence of Jews in Communist China is peculiar. But I suppose this could be explained by acknowledging, and it's really no secret, that Jews have been the driving force behind communism on an international level, and that Jews have a commitment to the struggles of the working class. Now, this still leaves a question about Jacob Schiff. Why would a leading capitalist banker support a communist revolution? And again, to explain this away, we only need to acknowledge that Jews regarded themselves as persecuted minorities in Tsarist Russia. Therefore, Schiff's commitment to the revolution was solely based on his commitment to liberating his own people. And these explanations are sufficient until we consider Uganda. When we look into Uganda, we find that Idi Amin had accepted Israeli and British funding for his coup in 1971. Apparently these investors became heavily involved in the new nation because later he ended up throwing the Israelis out of Uganda because they were destroying the economy. When he expelled the Israelis, he went from hero of Uganda to psychopath in the American press overnight. In response, Time magazine ran a clear propaganda piece claiming he kept severed heads in his freezer. And we're left to wonder, what was the real purpose of such a blatant propaganda article? Was it possibly to prepare America for war against Uganda, so that the investors who had been thrown out could recoup their losses? Well, what makes this so remarkable, though, is that here we have a clear example of Jewish investors involving themselves in a revolution in a foreign country for the sole purpose of enriching themselves at the expense of the native population. And all of the excuses go out the window. We see what this has been about all along. revolution is a business.
If I go to Israel, I used to stay with Dayan. He brings Air Force band playing for me. We stay together. But I must make it absolutely truth. The reason why I chased them from Uganda was because of the economy of Uganda. Uganda was going to be bankrupt. That is the reason why I chased away the Israelis.
And you said you were friends with Golda Meir.
Yes. I changed from Israeli alliance because Israeli are criminals.
Now that we're making progress and beginning to understand what really happens in the background of a revolution, there are a few pitfalls to be aware of. And we can observe two of those by studying Cuba, where at least one of Fidel Castro's financiers was a wealthy international Jewish businessman named Israel Ricardo Ciberana y Lobo, or just Ricardo Wolf. He's pictured here on the right with Golda Meir and Israeli president at the time, Yitzhak Ben-Zvi. After financing Castro, Dr. Wolf will go on to serve as the Cuban ambassador to Israel. And also of interest, Castro himself is of Jewish ancestry. But the first pitfall to avoid is our natural inclination to assume that if one side is financed by international businessmen, the other side must represent the good guys. And in the case of Cuba, the defending regime, led by Batista, was also deeply involved with international money, having close ties with Jewish mob boss Meyer Lansky. So it's safe to avoid that sort of polarized good guy, bad guy thinking. It's more revealing to identify leaders as being aligned with international elements or aligned with national elements. And as is often the case, in Cuba, both men owed allegiance to international investors. There's also one other detail that we can learn from the Cuban Revolution, and that is that the investors sometimes damaged their own people. While before the Bolshevik Revolution, Russian Jews were living among the lower class, so the process of collectivization had no negative impact on them, in Cuba, Jews were already up the social ladder, and they were firmly seated in the upper middle class and above. So the transition to communism damaged the Jewish community in Cuba. As we study revolutions and become aware of the leading role of Jewish investors, it's important not to be confused by the cacophony of opinions among different Jewish groups. Bear in mind also that many of Cuba's wealthy Jews were given refuge in Miami, making it the city that it is today. We find something similar occurred under Stalin as well, where some groups felt targeted by Stalin's policies, and yet others were satisfied. One extra thought I'll just include here. The amount of control exerted on the new nation really varies. In some cases, it seems as though the financiers simply ensure that the new nation honors their bonds and remains beneath the umbrella of the International Monetary Fund. And then in other cases, we see Jewish involvement throughout the top levels of the government. And these nations appear to be under firm control. For example, this was the case in the early Soviet Union. One other pitfall to avoid is the simplistic viewpoint that internationally financed revolutions all utilize the hammer and sickle logo. While all of the revolutions mentioned so far would be labeled Marxist revolutions, there are other revolutions that don't bear that trademark name. For example, many of the Arabian dynasties we know today were put in place after the fall of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, from a conflict instigated from within by a disproportionately Jewish group known as the Young Turks. In fact, I think it's safe to say that Marxism, as a political system anyways, has grown passé in recent years, while the newer model, the democratic revolution, is in fashion. And of course, this raises questions about other governments throughout history, and we have to wonder if they were all backed by international wealth. For example, what about Gaddafi of Libya, or Assad of Syria, or Abdul bin Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia and Pol Pot of Cambodia, just to name a few. So, what's gained from this ruthless business? Well, first and foremost, there's the return on capital in the form of the interest paid on the new bonds. The new nation is shackled with debt before it even begins. And this is really the tragic irony of the situation, since the nation, whether they realize it or not, likely went into revolt because of the burden of debt. And what's really sad is that any leadership among the revolution that refuses foreign aid will be crushed by those who accept it. Also gained from this business is the chance that the nation will remain open to multinational corporations. Maybe the nation offers up its natural resources or its labor. And not to be overlooked, in some cases a revolution allows for the liquidation of the existing intelligentsia, which reduces the nation's ability to threaten the global system or liberate itself. And this might actually be a greater incentive than we first realized, considering that an aristocracy is just a natural outgrowth of the best and brightest of the body of a nation, the cream of the crop, so to speak. So without an aristocracy, a nation has no real memory and lacks the leadership to defend itself. So let's go ahead and wrap up now by putting our research into the context of a larger timeline. How did all of this come about? How did we get from European colonialism to a state of permanent revolution? Well, colonialism can roughly be broken up into three pieces: the East, Africa, and the Americas. In the East, in China and India, there was the opium trade. In Africa, there was the diamond business. And then in the Americas, the slave trade, to name just a few. Our history books like to teach us that these enterprises were driven by European nation-states, and to some extent they were. However, behind many colonial operations, it should come as no surprise now, we find someone who is Jewish, like the Sassoon family, who monopolized the opium trade in the East, or, as we see in this list, demonstrating the Jewish monopoly over the American slave trade. Just a quick side note here. A history professor named Tony Martin, who's probably one of the world's leading experts on the history of slavery, has tried to bring this information to light only to meet insurmountable pressure from various Jewish groups like Hillel and the Anti-Defamation League. Impressively, Jewish groups like these have used the legal system and political correctness to effectively rewrite the history of Western civilization. In any case, another example can be seen in colonial Africa, where we do find the presence of a non-Jewish businessman now named Cecil Rhodes, but according to Jewish author Edward Epstein in his book The Rise and Fall of Diamonds, if we look behind Cecil Rhodes, we discover that he was financed by N&M Rothschild and Sons, an elite Jewish banking dynasty. In fact, if we were to look behind all of these men, we would likely find various Jewish banking dynasties. The old colonial system was unsustainable, though. It probably required too much police work. So it didn't take long for our international plutocrats to devise a new system that was both sustainable and more cost-efficient. And that new system is the revolution business, which we believe might be more appropriately named neo-colonialism. Thanks for watching.